So one of the things I was, you can stay up here for Martin's comments or depart the pattern. It's entirely up to you. Why don't you just hang out? Okay. Well, Martin's coming up to the stage. One of the things I'd also like to do is actually thank our remote viewers. We just mentioned the amount of countries that they're calling in to, and it also got me to thinking that there's been one topic that's been kind of going through my mind over and over again, and that's UAS, otherwise known as RPAs. Now imagine what's going to happen once we get through the integration standards and we have this combination of increasingly integrated operations where you could actually see the presence of UAS, the presence of remotely piloted aircraft, that's a multiple of the number of commercially manned aircraft that are deployed. Now imagine how you're going to have to address SMS, how you're going to address all these kind of data aggregation programs where you don't have the person physically inside the aircraft to provide these kind of reports, even though despite the fact that they're very, very necessary. So how's that for food for thought? And I imagine we'll be having a completely different conversation. And it speaks to Chuck's point about the need for SMS to continually evolve with the evolving technology and the airspace. So with that, I'm going to leave us with one final bit of expert insight for the day. We've heard a lot of great insights and perspectives from a large cross-section of our industry: pilots, airlines, manufacturers, and regulators. Now we'll ask our colleague Martin Eley to wrap it up for us. Transport Canada has a long and distinguished history of innovation in developing safety programs, and against that backdrop, we look forward to Martin's thoughts on the day's discussion. Over to you, Martin.
Afternoon, everyone. This is a good exercise in fatigue risk management, whether I can keep your attention long enough to get through a few notes here. It certainly was a pleasure to have the opportunity to come and speak today, because it gave me the excuse to actually sit through the whole symposium and hear a lot of good comment. So it's been very hard to figure out how I was going to summarize it. So in fact what I did is I made a few notes on the way through, not necessarily in sequence, but just things that came to mind as people were talking. A couple of places to underline what was said, other places hopefully to add a little bit of insight based on some of our experience. Certainly when we started off the day, there was a lot of talk about, how do we get past the sort of, educate versus punish approach? How do we deal with that? How do we deal with the public expectation? The safety in the media or in the public view. It's very difficult to even talk about risk, even though that's what we spend our lives managing. People just don't want to hear that terminology. So there's always a lot of trying to get that balance right. We say all the right things, but then there's a lot of media attention, and it came up today. People want to take action to make sure it's clear they're in charge, even though they understand the culture. So there was a recent case that we had in Canada. There was an accident several years ago. A number of people died on a single-engine commercial aircraft. As a result of that, we looked closely at the company. We weren't happy with what they were doing. We decided to take their certificate away and stop their operations. We have a group in Canada called the Transportation Appeal Tribunal of Canada, where anybody, if we take certificate action, people can go to that forum. They went to the tribunal agreed with them, and we were told to let them go back into service. So although they didn't actually go back into service, they then turned around and followed up with some litigation, basically saying, okay, we want to recoup the money that we lost because you put us out of business. So that case was going on for several years, and there was always a discussion about whether we should try and resolve it and settle, and we never got close to even settling. Eventually went to decision, and I think we were fortunate in the sense that the judge that worked the case seemed to have a very good insight into our work. His conclusions were very, very valuable from our point of view. And what I'd like to do is just to read you one paragraph from that decision, and I think that'll give you a sense of what he concluded. And the quote is as follows. In my view, the imposition of liability for economic loss to certificate holders would have a chilling effect on the ability of Transport Canada Civil Aviation and its inspectors in the exercise of their responsibilities and powers under the Act in the interest of public safety. This is particularly true when considering the discretion civil aviation inspectors must exercise in any given circumstance, including among other things, whether to proceed with enforcement action against aviation companies who are found to be in breach of the regulations, or whether to work with that company to try and effect change through a corrective action plan. This is just one paragraph of many in a 70-page decision. The judge was clearly a lawyer, so it was written in that terminology, but it just showed a really good understanding. So we were very pleased to actually have success in this particular case. The individual walked away with no damages. The costs are still being discussed. Since then, we've had at least one other case where they've withdrawn the litigation based on this particular jurisprudence. So this for us was a sort of watershed case in the sense that it really sent a message. If you do the right things, you follow due process, and you do all the things you're supposed to do, you're allowed to make a few little mistakes along the way. But if you're doing them for the right reason, at the end of the day, then your motivation is correct. We'll sort of stand by you in court. So that's a fairly recent decision. I thought it was relevant to some of the discussion we had earlier this afternoon here. So I have a number of notes that I made on the rest of the day, so bear with me because it's not a prepared speech. It's just me reminding myself of what I wanted to cover. Certainly, we talked a lot about our experience with SMS, and I don't particularly want to beat the drum. There are some things, though, that we've done as we've gone along. SMS is clearly what the industry has to do. Looking at our surveillance program, when we talk about SMS, it's really a systems-based approach, QMS if you like. We tried to take that same approach into our surveillance program. So we've developed a questionnaire, a risk-based questionnaire, and some of these are safety things. Some of the things are just change in a company, big change in the fleet, significant change in management. All of those things are indicators. The questionnaire has something like 70 questions, and based on that, we generate a risk profile for a company. We do that for all our companies. We then look at the risk exposure. Obviously, if it's a small company, that's very different from a mainline airline. And then looking at those, we use that as a basis for a 5-year surveillance program. So the high risk, obviously, we're looking at often. The ones that really have a good track record, that we show a lot of confidence, not a lot of change. It could be up to 5 years for some of the smaller companies, particularly, before we go back to that. So we think that makes a lot of sense. What it does is let us put our resources where the biggest risks are, rather than just inspecting by rote when we don't necessarily have a concern in some companies. Some of the other things we've heard, the discussions today, a lot of companies who really get it, they say that it's good for business in specific ways. If they develop the right culture, then it affects everything in the workplace, not just the aviation aspects. We've had companies talk about improved insurance premiums, relief from workers' compensation premiums, so things that are tangible to them where people are recognising the improvement of culture, even though for us, the one question that we've had trouble answering within government is what difference do safety management systems make? How can you prove that SMS is actually good for the accident record, or is it just that the companies are getting better at it? So that question remains unanswered, but we look at some of these other things as, okay, if other people are recognising improvement in safety, we believe that's the culture that we're trying to generate. I think there was some good comment today. Every company we identified an accountable executive, and certainly if you have an accountable executive doesn't get it, then you see that throughout the company. And we do a lot of proactive interviewing when we do assessments of companies to look at their SMS, and we do find that actually gives us a pretty good insight into the culture, whether in fact they're sort of, walking the talk, or whether in fact they're just going through the motions. And I'm flipping around here a little bit, as I mentioned. I think as we talk about systems and the way we look at things, that's been reflected too. Certainly in accident investigation, we've moved away from pilot error. It's more about, okay, what environment created the opportunity for that particular action to happen? Was it training? Was it the cockpit environment, or a combination of things? And that, again, it lines up with a systems-based approach. You're looking at all the factors, not any particular one, and recognizing at times there will be specific causes. There was one comment today that I thought was very important, and I wanted to just touch on that. There was talk about some of the advances we've made putting systems in place, and it was very clear that when we're looking at whether it's an accident or whether it's just looking at trends, the solution itself is important, but all the things that go around it are often just as important. You can put a great system in place, but if you don't train, integrate it into the system properly, so looking at all those activities in a holistic manner, that's actually something We've recently been able to embrace, we did a major overhaul in our rulemaking process. We've tried to get away from working groups, which they have value, but sometimes they can take on a life of their own. So what we've been trying to do on an issue is to have a focus group, stakeholders in the room for a week, really work it, a little bit like the ARC format the FAA uses, if you like. But what that does is it also gives us the opportunity to talk about some of the things. So there may be a hard regulatory piece in there, but there might also be good practices, training aspects, some of the softer things. In a lot of cases, we find the stakeholders will embrace that, go away and start doing those things long before we ever get to a rule change. So just looking at, not just focusing on the rule, but looking at the whole package really does seem to bring some dividends. In terms of, we talked a lot about CAST today, quite rightly so. It's a very strong player. One of the things that we get from sharing in that activity is there's some very healthy approach to defining priorities. One of the challenges we have, and I suspect the FAA has, is actually what are you going to work on first? The resources tend to be more and more limited. Where do you put your money? If you have a robust approach to identifying the priorities and you share those, then authorities can work together on those particular things, knowing that collectively they're going to get the biggest bang for their buck. So, quite apart from the obvious safety benefits, that gives us the opportunity occasionally in dealing with our own accident investigation safety board to say, even though we think that's important, in the bigger picture, we don't see it as a priority, so we're not going to respond to that in the short term. So at least gives us a rationale for that position rather than just being in an endless battle of why aren't you doing this? There was quite a bit of discussion during the course of the day on people having concerns, the need to develop trust. There is no question that is a strong piece. I actually see the regulator, we have an opportunity here to actually be the role model. When you're talking about trust in any relationship, it's there's always discussion about, well, who's going to trust who first? Well, when they trust us, we'll trust them, and I think most of you have had those discussions somewhere. But as government, I think we have the opportunity to take a leadership role and actually be prepared to express trust. Not unlimited trust, but obviously be the one to sort of start with that sort of approach. And one of the easiest quotes to remember on that, many of you probably remember it from Ronald Reagan, trust but verify, and I think we heard a version of that earlier on here today. So it's not just trusting people and walking away, but making sure you do the work, but starting from a position of trust. And we're trying very hard to sort of promote that culture internally, and I think a lot of the industry is ready, and people will move forward. One of the big challenges we have at the moment is on the surveillance side. We've embraced a systems approach. Certainly if a company steps up, identifies an issue and deals with it, then our role is to make sure their approach is valid. We wouldn't normally go in and then take enforcement on top of that if they've dealt with it proactively. If, on the other hand, we find something and it's got to that stage, then maybe enforcement would be the appropriate tool. But what we're finding is when we do a systems-based approach in terms of the way we do our assessments and inspections, trying to rationalize that with a somewhat compliance-based enforcement regime, we're having a lot of trouble getting to the meeting of the minds on those two pieces. So there's a lot of work going on internally at the moment. You can have a systems-based approach, but then you get to enforcement and you haven't collected enough samples, enough evidence, the enforcement people send you back. So how do we get to effective tools that we use in the right way, but making them work together? So that's currently one of the focuses we have, one of the things we've learned as we've tried to move forward. Certainly in terms of culture, we really have to acknowledge the diversity of social cultures around the world may be a barrier in some cases to the universal just culture. I think a lot of that is to talk by example, talk about the things that work, and I think that may be a hard thing to do from a government point of view, but certainly companies that do well, perhaps in the Western environment, in talking to some of the different cultures, perhaps in Asia, showing what the benefits are, having those discussions as a company might be a better way to sell it than to actually try to impose a culture which is clearly never going to work. So I think the challenge is to find ways to communicate the value of it in the hope that we find ways to make it work around the world. One of the things that our Deputy Minister, who's been with us just a little over a year, he was dealing with a number of different safety issues, and he realised that we did not have any consistency across transport. And he deals with transport, so he's dealing with aviation, marine, surface, rail, safety and security. And he inspired us to put out a directive in recent times, Safety and Security Oversight Directive. And really it was the first time that we'd ever told our inspection staff how they should behave. So there were comments earlier today about, well, you know, we get different people, we have to deal with the people, and we all have that. But it's very hard to actually go and criticise people if you've never actually told them what you expect. So he saw this directive as a way of saying to people, this is the way we expect you to deal, we want you to be fair, we want you to be honest, make decisions, tough decisions when you have to, build relationships. So all that stuff is in there. And I think it was a good way forward of at least starting that move to people being perhaps a little bit more consistent across the whole program. And there's certainly other areas where we've recognised that we haven't always told people what to do, but we're not happy about the way they actually do it. And my favourite is the approval of manuals. You can put 50 inspectors in a room, give them a manual, and they'll look at it 50 different ways. So again, expressing our expectations on how you do that work, and we haven't always done that consistently, so it's very hard to criticise the way they do it. There was some discussion today. The particular example that was discussed at the time was around fatigue, and you know how you have the reporting culture, making sure that people are able to do that, but at the same time, not getting the knee-jerk reaction. And I think the answer to all of that is good process. And I think we heard that later in the day again here to also. If there's clear process that you follow, getting to the right people involved, that's how you get away from the knee-jerk reaction. But it really is the saviour. So if there is a culture, you have to push people into process, and I think that's really how you make change over time. In terms of SMS, although we've had quite a lot of it in place for a long time, in a number of areas, there's areas we still haven't implemented it. We are in the process of having the discussion with senior management about moving on into the other areas, the smaller operators, the flight training schools, because one of the things that we're learning more and more is that if you're operating in the system, there's a lot of synergy from everybody having the same sort of approach to life. We had an example recently of a carrier started operating into a different airport where there was already a carrier. An issue came up. He started talking to them about the way they dealt with it. He was somewhat surprised that they were not using their SMS methodology whatsoever. So in the space of a few months, he was able to engage them and find that, in fact, they started to get it. And now they work together, we're having a common approach to issues. So getting all elements of the system to that same point, I think there will be a lot of synergy moving forward. There was some discussion earlier on this afternoon, I think it was, about or this morning perhaps, getting the message out about our safety record, about the way we do business. We've certainly had that challenge in terms of SMS, selling its benefits. There's a lot of the industry get it and certainly promote it. Labour at times is actually one of the groups that does tend to push back. In fact, our minister, our current minister, Minister Raitt, she's so convinced by the value of SMS that she actually encouraged one of our standing committees of Parliament to actually take it on as part of a study they were doing, because she wanted to have the public debate. Dave DeVoe, who was on one of the panels earlier today, he appeared before that committee on behalf of the association that he's with, and really the minister's objective was really to get all of the sides of the story on the table. So although we were getting some negative noise, she wanted to get those positive stories out there, with the idea that the committee, when they produce their report, will actually come to some solid conclusions which will help us get the momentum we need to move forward. So just sort of closing here, it's not exactly a summary, but it's sort of the way it came to me. In terms of, as we moved into SOS, we talked about proactive, about reporting systems, about companies looking at their own data consistently to get information. We've heard a lot today about sharing that data, with a lot of the initiatives the FAA has put in place. But the reality is, as we get better at it, if the companies individually deal with things, and then as a system we deal better with things, it's going to be harder and harder to see those trends because there aren't going to be many. So it's quite clear that we need to continue to grow the size of the sample more and more, because otherwise, if they only happen once in a while, we're not even going to see those for all the data we have. So the initiative here by ALPA and ongoing with the FAA particularly, to try and step up the level of engagement internationally, I think we will need that in the coming years, because we will push down a lot of the things we see we will need to make sure we get a more complete picture. So with that, I'll thank you for your attention at the end of the day, and if it was a little bit long, I apologize, but thank you, Sean.
Any questions for Martin? Three for three.
3 for 3, okay.
Thank you so much. A round of
Okay.
applause for Martin, please.
Okay, thank you.
Well, thanks again, Martin, and as always, we really do appreciate your insightful remarks, and I think if you see some of the things that Transport Canada has been doing, especially in the world of SMS, they're really leading the world, especially in implementing some of the things that have been addressed through Annex 19 at the ICAO level. Something else kind of dawned on me as well, going off script again. And we started out this morning, I introduced Dr. Len Friedman, who actually, 5 minutes after I introduced him, he just found out that he got announced by George Washington University as the new chairman of the department. So he actually had to leave shortly after that, completely unexpected, so I offered my congrats to him. One of the things that it was brought out, I think, by Mr. McKenna over there was we don't celebrate enough of the successes that we realize through these amazingly efficient, proactive and predictive systems that are continuing to evolve. And by contrast, one of the reasons the medical community is so interested in learning some of the lessons that we have continued to learn and adopt and refine from the aviation world is because, depending on the metrics, there's anywhere between about 98,000 and 440,000 preventable deaths annually in the United States alone. And that's to misdiagnosis, that's to transcription errors, that's to basic failure to adhere to common accepted practices. That's an amazing number when you think about it. And by contrast, one of the numbers that I always use to try to translate into people speak what the benefits of really evolved proactive data management systems are and SMS systems and very robust safety ecosystems was one that I actually got from Flight Safety Foundation a while ago. And Kevin's still here. Yep, there he is, and you'll correct me. I think I got this right, but basically it was this, that you could fly in our country, you could fly every single day for, I think it was about 130,000 years, every single day, before statistically your number would be up. And I think that really, that's a pretty visceral number. I think everybody can relate to that, whether or not they're in the business of safety or not. It kind of puts things in perspective. So whenever we put together one of these events, I'm always amazed at the talent and the experience and the expertise that we get from our industry. Today we heard from folks from nearly every aspect of establishing, maintaining, and effectively using data in proactive safety programs. So let's please acknowledge all of our speakers, all of our panelists, and also our sponsors again at Boeing, MITRE, A4A, RAA, and I forgot one. What was the last one? Boeing, Airbus, A4A, Flight Safety. Okay. Yeah, Alzheimer's is setting in, right? ALPA has done these. Actually, let's pause, and I'd like to offer one more round of applause for our sponsors and our panelists. Thanks. ALPA has done these one-day events on a lot of specific topics over the last several years, and they have proven very useful to allow stakeholders to come together and discuss issues that we feel are very important. I would ask for your continued support and, more importantly, for your feedback, and I actually got some from Paul Morrell when we were walking into the event today about some things that we could add to a future event. We know the amount of time that you're all asked to spend going to one meeting or another, and it's important that you get the most bang for your buck for the time that you put in these events. Please let us know what you found useful and what we can do better. Those yellow critique forms are a good way to do that, but feel free in any way whatsoever you would like to do, either talk directly to one of us, one of our staff, send us an email, write it on a banana peel. We're certainly open to any feedback in any manner whatsoever. One final note before I close, I'd like to recognize the staff, because it would be remiss not to acknowledge those folks who put in a huge amount of time and energy to make those of us up here look so good. In particular, I'd like to thank the members of the Engineering and Air Safety Department, the communications department, our strategic member development and resources folks, and specifically we're talking about Chad Ballantyne, Chris Weaver, Jody Crescice, Mark Angolia, Eric Davis, Petra Duran-Smith, Marvin Ramirez, Logan Durham, Kelly Graniello, Tina Long, and they never put their names down for me, but Keith Hagee, Chris Baum, and of course Jerry right there, who did an awful lot of planning with us. And I'd also like to, even though Don McClure wasn't involved in the planning of the event, he's been a stalwart supporter for all these programs through a number of years, and I'd like to close by thanking them all as well. So a round of applause for them, please. Finally, let me remind you that we are only the opening act for a bigger and I wouldn't say better, but a much more expansive event, and that's the FAA EASA Safety Conference that kicks off tomorrow in Bethesda. They have a great agenda, and in fact, they're going to actually be overlapping some of the items that we just talked about today, as well as some of the other things that are near and dear to my heart, such as RPA. So they'll be piggybacking on a lot of these discussions. I'll be there. I know a number of you will be there. So I'm looking forward to seeing you throughout the course of the week. Thank you very much for your attendance. Thank you for your discussion. And I wish you safe travels and a very good evening. Thank you.